We will go on to the last panelist for the day. Rajyashri, are you here?
Yes, hello, I'm here.
Okay, hi. I'll just give a brief introduction. She's a visual artist and ethnographer, mixed media artist based in Pune. Her Instagram profile sums her up. She likes food, Dalit literature, and is constantly stressing about making her mom proud. I'm sure she will be at the end of today.
That's so
Her
true.
talk is titled Everyday Resistance, Reclaiming Dalit Heritage for Oneself. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me and for all the previous panelists and your talks. So I guess the theme is redefinitions and appropriations, and I'm particularly interested in what redefinition could possibly stand for. With appropriation, I think I'll leave it to those who appropriate to figure that out. um, but with redefining, I guess, Dalit heritage, I think it's quite a complicated word, heritage itself. I think heritage often signifies something to do with pride. And when we're looking at Dalit communities and we're talking about heritage, um, it's a bit tough for me to use very easily, because there is, of course, pride, there is resistance, but there's also so much oppression and so much discrimination, and all of it seems to go hand in hand. So I in my practice, even though I'm talking about Dalit cultures, I use Dalit history, so I can sort of be neutral and include these complexities of experiences in my work. When I'm looking at Dalit history, there isn't really that much of an archive available as compared to archives of other upper caste communities, whether it's cultural or literary. Um, and so I often go back to what I think is the root of it, which is the Manusmriti. And I guess, as we all know, the Manusmriti has all these rules which really situate caste in its place, situate the role of women, and through these rules we're able to govern how Dalit lives were empowered or disempowered. And one of the particular rules that I focus on is the denial of education, the denial of literacy, and what that exactly means. So here is a text written, and the people that it's writing against are unable to read it. It's sort of this strange dark circle. Mm, so I've been looking a lot since 2016, really thinking about the power of the written word. And when you're talking about the history of even a country, who's writing these narratives, who's got this access. And in India, it's just quite simple that most Dalit people just haven't had access to literacy, even now. So that's sort of how I usually begin my work, by thinking about that in relation to the burning of the Manusmriti, which took place in 1927 by Dr. Ambedkar in December. So he followed it from the Mahad Satyagraha that had taken place in March of 1927. And in December, he was going to go and drink water from Mahad once more as an act of resistance. But they changed their plans, I think, thinking that perhaps there's too much threat of violence. And they changed their plans and decided to burn the Manusmriti instead. And by burning the Manusmriti, they were rejecting all of its history. They were rejecting the idea of caste, and they were rejecting this hierarchy. and for me, it really symbolizes that we need to how important this access to education has been for my community, how important this access to just simply learning how to read and write has been, mainly because it allows us to tell our own stories finally. And the reason there isn't enough of Dalit archives, say, is because we haven't been able to necessarily produce them. So even when we're looking at, say, photography or video, again, these are tools that were expensive. And only now, really, with this democratization of, everybody having phones, everybody having easy access to this technology, are we really seeing these archives being created every single day. That's one thing that I'm particularly interested in. But like more specifically, I've been interested in Dalit literature. Now, Dalit literature really, I think, blew up in the 60s, 70s, 80s. And I think it has its relationship with how much access people got to education. And I think the more slowly, the more that people were able to access education, I think one of the first instincts perhaps is that you want to write your own story. You want to write your own history. You want to write what you have been feeling, because perhaps you're the first person in your family for hundreds of years, if not thousands, to be able to do so. So I've spent a lot of the last 4 years sort of devoted to trying to just read as much Dalit literature as possible, as part of the work, but also personally, because I didn't learn enough about my own heritage in the schools that I went to. I think none of us really learned about caste. So it's been a sort of personal exercise to, learn, instead of, hounding my family for things. Why not actually see how much Dalit literature actually exists, which like a lot of it does, and learn it as just this way of learning about Dalit history. And a particular sort of, I don't know, I'm interested in food, as you said. I'm interested in food, not really for the food itself, but I'm interested in how sort of everyday things like eating and drinking and maybe walking around and falling in love, how these are impacted by caste. Now, the Manusmriti also has a lot of rules around eating and drinking. It forbids intercaste dining, which is still practiced. It also in some places suggests like the diets that people are allowed to have, how Dalit people are only allowed to, eat, like scavenge, really. And I think in 2016, when the Una protests took place, it shook me, and I started thinking more seriously, not just about beef, but just about what is my family's relationship with food, what is my community's relationship with food. And the more I started sort of looking for it, I did come across some academic texts. Well, the main one was Isn't This Plate Indian? Written in 2009 by the Women's Studies Center in Pune University. So this was an incredible text. And there was also a Marathi Dalit cookbook written by Shahu Patore. I think it had just come out in 2016, just then. So these were the only real resources that I found. And I think in a naive way, I was sort of thinking, why aren't there more Dalit cookbooks? And even that phrase, Dalit cookbook, it sounds a bit ridiculous, because a cookbook often implies that you have a kitchen that with all these utensils and ingredients. It always implies that you can read and write, which is again one basic thing that not many people have access to here. And it also implies that in a way you can cook the food of another community, of another person's, and you will also then experience what they are experiencing. Maybe you'll be transported to their country or their lives. And this I find quite uncomfortable, because especially with Dalit food, there's not, obviously there's joy, there's celebration, there's feasting like every other community, but there's also so much guilt around eating certain kinds of foods. There's shame attached to it. There's hunger. That has always been quite a strong theme in most of the Dalit literature I've read. There's eating leftovers and begging, not as solitary sort of personal experiences, but as caste-based practices. So eating leftovers, not, oh, because we don't have food today, but we've probably never had food, and this is our role in society to go get leftovers. So I started learning about these more and more through Dalit literature, through reading more autobiographies. And the more autobiographies I started covering, the more I felt like, wow, there's actually some of the autobiographies, maybe like 50% or 60% of the book is almost dedicated to food, not intentionally, but I think because oppression and the stomach are so sort of deeply linked together, and often autobiographies begin in this linear timeline of, when I was a child, this is what was happening. For children, I think discrimination is often felt through hunger, through not being able to eat enough. So I started noticing all this, and then also feeling like, wow, there's perhaps no need for a Dalit cookbook as such, because all of these autobiographies have so much writing about Dalit food, and they teach you so much of it without sort of simplifying it. With the whole sort of format of a cookbook is so like it doesn't tell you about what the person has perhaps been experiencing while eating that, other than some sort of delicious narratives or something like that. But I think it's almost quite reductive in a sense. And as part of my practice, I then began to every autobiography I read, I would underline each and every part that the writer was talking about food, whether it was, I went to school and I had to skip school to go hunting in the forest or to go foraging because I was hungry, and, Guruji beat me the next day, but I had to risk it. Or, sneaking in some beef, or dealing with alcohol addiction, water. I sort of, water and food sort of go together. So I started underlining all these things, and then I began creating little booklets, which I called recipe booklets, that made it sound almost like a recipe. I'll share them with you all. Maybe I can, I'll just share one right now. Okay. Yes. Can you all see this?
Yes.
Yes, great. Thanks. So this recipe booklet I've called "Do You Have the Courage to Drink from the Pond?" And it's based on Daya Pawar's autobiography called Baluta. It was translated just in 2016 or 2017 into English. And the photograph here is of my family members, so my brother and my cousins and my aunts, sitting by some mangoes that they had just collected. So what I do is I do weave in my family narratives, but through photography, because I also recognize that a lot of our family photos, perhaps like everybody else's family photographs, are often revolving around birthdays or celebrations or activities that involve a lot of food. And I wanted to sort of address that and also respect that as its own narrative of food. But yeah, so do you have the courage to drink from the pond? This is Dabba. Long to see your wife in a 5-yard sari like Brahmin or Banya women, instead of the 9-yard sari in the traditional Mahar style. But mother might have none of it. You might feel aggrieved. One day, if the dabbawala does not arrive on time to fetch your lunch, your wife might worry that you have nothing to eat. She might come to your office with your sister and your lunch. Feel touched by the gesture, but worry about what your friends in office might think of her. They might not recognize her as your wife. They might take her to be a servant. They might call you a sly dog for having a hot one as a maid. Feel embarrassed for not having the courage to tell them the truth. This one is tea. On Eid, your lover might put a glass bowl of sheer kurma, a delicacy made of vermicelli and milk, and into your sister's hand and say, "This is for him." You might be halfway through a glass of tea. A viciousness might awaken you. Think about how her people avoid your home and see you as unclean. Stop your lover. Ask her if she really loves you. Ask her if she will drink this tea that has touched your lips. She might say she would drink poison if you gave it to her. Watch her swig the tea that has touched your mouth. Pleasure might tingle through your body all day. Tsanya. Dry pieces of beef from a carcass in the sun. Cut them into thin strips called tsanya. Dry them by the fireplace. The smoke will turn them bright red. Feel proud of the Mahars when you read that they smoke pork in the West in the same way. When the tsanya are dry, cut them into pieces called todkya. Hold them in reserve for the bad months of Shravan and Ashad. Sometimes a beautiful white fungus might grow over the todkya. Maggots might sprout on them. Dry them once more in the courtyard to clean them. Guard them with sticks. Fill your pockets with crisply roasted tsanya. Go to school. Sneak off at the back of the school in the break. Have yourself a feast. A Brahmin friend might turn up and ask what you are eating all alone. Flush with embarrassment. For want of a better answer, say you are eating some crunchies. He might ask you for a taste. Hesitate. Think about what might happen if the village finds out that you have polluted a Brahmin. Your friend might plead for some. Give in. Give him some crunchies. He might love the taste. He might spread the word to his friends. They might want some crunchies too. Later, you might realize that they had known what they were eating all along, but did it all the same. Soma Mahar. The village might be in fear of you for the poison you have developed, Soma Mahar. If you deploy this pure white weapon, the cattle in the village will begin to die off one by one. Although it is a horrible thing to do, use it only when a money-maddened tyrant oppresses the Mahars. Mix the poison with some millet or work it into a bhakri. In the dead of night, when no one can see, feed it to the animal. Any stripling, even a child the size of a fist, can do this. Kill 2 birds with 1 stone. You get to land a blow to the enemy and the meat and the hide of the animal too. Baluta. Take the village taxes into town. Run in front of the horse of any important person coming into the village. Tend to his animals, feed and water them. Give them medicines, make proclamations announcing funerals from village to village, drag away the carcasses of dead animals, chop firewood, play music day and night at festivals, Welcome new bridegrooms at the village borders on their wedding day. For all this, get your balut, your share of the village harvest. Go with your family when the grain has been stacked on the threshing floor. Carry a coarse blanket. Claim your share. The farmers might grumble as they hand over the grain. They might call you low-born scum. Don't be a pushover. Give the Marathas as good as you get. They might try to fob you off with grain from the top of the heap where it is at its thinnest. Demand grain from the bottom where the ripe grain settles. If they don't agree, spread your blanket on the grain. Make the Marathas give you whatever is beneath. This might be accompanied by a stream of abuse. Ignore them completely. Tie up your bundles. Alcohol. After Dada dies, methodically and carefully smash his still and all the paraphernalia that goes with distilling. Have no use for such an inheritance. In later life, never become addicted to alcohol. You might face many trials. You might often be deeply disturbed. On more than one occasion, you might contemplate suicide. But instead of drowning your sorrows in alcohol, the word might evoke a series of family tragedies. Don't become a complete teetotaler. When hobnobbing with important people, drink a peg or two. But you might be more interested in the food that accompanies the drinks. Intoxicate yourself with life, a natural internal intoxication that makes the high of alcohol seem pale in comparison. That's it. So the end of it just says from Daya Pawar's Baluta. And I'll go back to me. So these are the sort of booklets I create, and I've made about 15 or 16 of them. I'm very, very slow at reading nowadays, but I mean, it's sort of since 2017. And I don't really rush myself too much. Whenever I do come across an autobiography, I'll sit and sort of put it together as a recipe and a recipe booklet. And then these often inform my later like work, like sculptures or these photo archives and things like that. But I'm more interested in, like, I do love doing these recipe booklets because it is an active sort of redefining in some ways of this Dalit literature, but acknowledging that, you know, this hasn't come from my head alone, and also that I don't perhaps need to go and do on-ground ethnographic research when there is so much available in Dalit literature that perhaps just hasn't been looked at in that lens too strongly.
Just a point of time, Rajesh.
Oh yes, sure.
Another minute or so.
Perfect. I was just ending, so great. Yeah, and I think because most of my work is shown in galleries where, you know, unfortunately the audience is mostly upper caste. These booklets, they can sort of take them and then go and buy this literature for themselves and read about it, just as a way to push that, you know, there are so many possibilities available for learning about Dalit history, and people don't have to always end up with just sort of one reference or one person's things. That's it. I'll end. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rajyashri. I think that rounded off 4 very fascinating talks by 4 people who are so multifaceted. I think that's what makes them good at what they do. Tom, do you want to attempt a summary?
That's going to be quite a task. Are we going to take questions, or should I summarize?
I suggested, yeah, because we don't have any questions as of now. So
all right. Oh. Okay, that's going to be one hell of a task
I
trying to
know.
summarize um, for such so rich um, kind of engaging discussion that you almost forget to keep track of your role as a person to keep note of it. You are so involved in it that it's been extremely engaging and making my task of trying to recap very difficult. But nonetheless, I think let me try and for the participants as well, excuse me, try and see what the key messages of each one of them were saying. There is much more, and I know I will not do full justice to it. So some key things that my takeaways, you could add on yours to that. And I'm sure this is like looking at this multi perspective of the same object that I think was the key message that came through each one of them, the multiple ways of it, the complexities of it. And therefore, here's an attempt at what my takeaways were. I think Gunjal began the whole thing by talking about the idea of participatory culture, and the idea of politics of the stage, and how that in a tribal culture that is come from, that is based in that it creates and looks at culture or the stage in a different kind of politics, and a politics of participation, accepting each one as they are and not as a slave to a tune or a structure or any of that. It's not about creating a power structure of performer and the spectator and so on and so forth. But it is more like a co-creator of an art. And when he was saying that, I went back to my student days when I had the fortune of actually partaking some of that immense culture of participation and open acceptance by the Uraon community in his neighboring state of Chhattisgarh. So it's that culture of participatory co-creation with no prejudices and so on and so forth. And the whole idea of dancing to survive. I think that was the key messages and key takeaways that I was able to get from that rich explanation by Gunjal. Swarnamalia, of course, talked about a huge issue around, assuming somebody as an unfinished subject. So that assumption is the problematic premise on which many conversations begin, or many conversations even take root in. And therefore, the very beginning itself is a problematic one, particularly when we are talking about Devadasi culture, or the appropriation of the dance form, and then the attempt at reframing that into something which is so top down, something which is so based not so much in the lived reality of the person themselves, but of an external uh, uh, import, etc. And so I think her key thing was that it sums up by saying why you should not write about Devadasis. And it kind of sums up the argument in a sense that it is something problematic at multiple levels, and therefore allowing them to define themselves, redefine themselves, allowing them to find themselves, and so on and so forth. So huge amount of, like this biggest problem of this, even though talking about a power relationship and appropriation, assuming a power by considering them as an unfinished subject. So much in there for that. Madan, I think the whole idea of, the entire disconnect between culture, heritage, and the lived realities of people who that culture is of. So, on the one hand, you have an art that is celebrated as world heritage, and on the other, you see that the very same art is like nothing but denigrated as a patriarchal object of sexual desire, or not just desire. Desire is a good word. I think as an object that you can appropriate, and therefore degrading and denigrating the entire identity of the person and the art itself. And when it comes to D&T communities particularly, not just the one community, he talked about them as a group as well. The whole idea of, how, while you can celebrate some parts of it, and how rest of the mainstream or so-called administration, the police and so on and so forth, are caught up in the dark ages of Criminal Tribes Act and so on and so forth, while they are, without batting an eyelid, put a prefix to their name and name them as, a community with their community name as criminal tribes, while they would never say that a Brahmin thief or a thief or a rapist, but happily will say, name a D&T community. So the kind of, two ends of this whole idea about heritage, and heritage itself, therefore reclaiming heritage itself, not in any sense an assured way of the well-being of the community. Communities continue to be marginalized while you celebrate their heritage and package it, and probably for a kind of totally different audience. So a disengaged, not political engagement with heritage is the problem, I think, which he was trying to portray. And Rajyashri, of course, in a very involved way, though I'm not a big foodie, the biggest lesson to me was that even something seemingly so innocuous as the topic of cooking, pardon my saying innocuous, I know it is much more than that. Cooking is deeply political. It is completely, the whole idea of how discrimination often begins with hunger is like a, deep, very engaged look into the realities of Dalit life, is what that experience and that expression and what you're saying, that it, even small things like that, it kind of builds up, and you can actually see the deeper connects, the deeper deprivations, the deeper marginalization, and to me, the deeper politics, be it linked to the Manusmriti or the whole idea of denial of education and so on, which I think Rajyashri brought out very, very eloquently and clearly, and through much of that writing as well. And I think one thing was that, the whole idea of what is heritage, I think that is where she began her discourse. What is heritage? And often you look at heritage as something to be proud of. You take pride in your heritage, but that's a difficult one when you talk about from a Dalit perspective. And therefore, is that again, like earlier Swarnamalia was saying, for something to be looked at as an unfinished subject and therefore needing an external intervention, or is that something that need to be self-claimed, reclaimed, so on and so forth. So in a sense, I see a huge connect between all of what the panelists said, as well as the distinct delineation of this whole idea of heritage, etc. And since today being the death anniversary of Che, like he said, the revolution is not an apple that falls when it is ripe. You might have to make it fall. So similarly, I think much of the message in a sense was that there is an internal drive that is required. There is an internal drive that needs to be respected. There's an internal politics and leadership that when we talk about subaltern, that needs to be respected, that needs to be not just respected, I think that needs to be engaged and walked along with. That's how I would see, in a sense, there's some, I'm sure I missed quite a bit of richness, but